Welcome back. You're listening to the defense's closing arguments in the trial of Jeffrey Willis out of Michigan, and he is accused of kidnapping and killing Jessica Haringa, a 25-year-old mom who went missing back in 2013. Carissa Kranz, you're a new host here at Law and Crime. Welcome. This is the first time we're on together.
Yes, it's nice to be with you.
You too. So, you know, the defense is trying to sort of make light of the fact that this guy wanted a pair of his coworkers' underwears, but it's odd. So how does he even overcome something like that?
Well, I guess they're airing his dirty laundry,
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Well, there's no doubt that this guy is creepy, and the defense is even admitting in his closing argument that I don't know how to come back from this. You're hearing all these things, and I'm not sure how to talk to you after you hear all these awful things about my client. He might be a creepy dude. He might have pornography on his computer. He might be into grotesque crimes. He may even be a convicted murderer, but that doesn't mean he did this murder of Jessica
so
Haringa.
he's a convicted murderer, but that doesn't mean he's a murderer? Or is that exactly what it means?
Well, I think the defense is saying, you know, the prosecution hasn't proven its case and met its burden beyond any and all reasonable doubt that he actually committed this murder. He might be a murderer, and he's a murderer, and he's intrigued with murder, and he thrives off of murder, and he's bloodthirsty, but he didn't commit this case.
But then you sort of lose the oomph behind this argument, like he's a creep, but he's not a killer. Because they do have to admit that he was convicted as a killer, right? So you can't really go down that route of, yeah, he likes underwear and he likes all this porn and everything, and he likes these sick videos of women being tortured, but he's not a killer. You can't say that here.
Yeah, this is a circumstantial evidence case, and the prosecution is hanging its hat on all these prior bad acts, and the judge is letting it in because there's a common scheme and plan in these crimes.
Right.
This is his third alleged known crime. Who knows if there's many more. He had a file on his computer named VIX for victims.
Right.
So,
and the defense went into that. The defense said, you know, he's turned on by this stuff. He's turned on by murder. He's fascinated by this stuff, but it doesn't mean he did anything.
Right.
But we know in another case he did.
Right. So that's where the defense is the prosecution's hanging at their hat by saying, look at all these bad things. Look, this is a bad guy. He's a creepy guy. Look at all these awful things he's done, and all of these prior bad acts are coming out, and the judge is allowing it in because the judge thinks, well, it's not really prejudicial. It's relevant. It's probative. The jury needs to hear this to come to a verdict. And the defense is saying, this is all prejudicial. I don't know how to come back from this. I don't even know how to talk to you, because if you're going to base your decision based on all these prior bad acts, well, Mike, I can't really come back from that. But if you take these facts and only these facts, you really can't find my client guilty because the prosecution hasn't met its burden. And that's the system. That's the system we live in.
Right. Well, that's the legality of it, but you have common people there. These are everyday people. So do you think they're just laughing at the fact that he's saying all this isn't proof that he's going to act on it just because he's fascinated by murder and he loves watching people being tortured and killed? He gives this example: just because you go to a superhero movie doesn't mean you wear a cape. Unless you wore a cape the night before, well, then it does, right? I mean, he killed before. So do you think they're just sitting there scratching their heads like, this is laughable?
I think the jury is connecting the dots. The jury is not stupid. Well, I've been surprised by jurors. But
yeah, be careful what you say.
But
let's say some people are uneducated or unfamiliar with the system.
Yes.
You know, sometimes the system can be very complex, and you've got people of all ages and all education levels in there. So sometimes you'll see somebody who's in college,
right,
who just wants to get back to go to the frat party, and they're sitting through a murder trial.
And that's true. And you never know what someone's thinking. I mean, just looking at Jeffrey Willis standing trial right now, he looks like a normal guy. But he's obviously deranged and has all sorts of awful, scary, gruesome, creepy thoughts going through his head.
Right.
So who knows what the jurors are actually thinking. But
also the defense made him look like the guy next door, right? Because we've seen pictures of him from before where he didn't look anything like the way he looks in court.
Right. He looks very clean cut in court, very, you know.
He's got the glasses,
yeah,
with a little bit of a nerdy look.
Yeah, he's taking notes. I mean, so I know we have listeners that aren't actually seeing what we see here, but he looks down, he's got his glasses, he looks like he's studying, he looks serious, he looks conservative.
He looks scholarly, to be honest.
He looks normal.
He's got this facial hair
Yeah.
now. His hair is dark. Before, we've seen pictures of it where it was like bleached out.
I think scholarly's the right answer. He's got his tie. He looks clean cut. I mean, this isn't a guy that you would run from. I think this is a guy that you would say, oh my God, I'm stranded on the side of the road. I don't have a cell phone. I'm lost. He's offering help. He's not someone that I would automatically run from.
Not to mention the woman who was accused him of kidnapping and raping her, who says they met in a Bible study class at a resource center, that they loved studying Bible. So yeah.
You know, you never know what someone's thinking. You know, sometimes they have a front, sometimes they have a facade. And this guy, you know, who knows? I would like to see actually up on the screen, if possible, you know, him without glasses. I don't even think that exists.
Yeah,
I want to look
into
his eyes. Like, what does a serial killer, cold-blooded murderer really look like deep in his eyes? Every picture, he's got these glasses. It's almost like he wants this barrier from the audience.
It's kind of hard to tell. It looks like there's almost nothingness
empty.
there. Yeah,
Nothing.
it does look like emptiness, but that's a mugshot, of course, so we don't know the circumstances. Let's go to some testimony of this coworker who says that he was seeking out her underwear. Testimony of a former coworker of Jeffrey Willis who talks about her gun being stolen literally from her home, as well as her underwear. Was the underwear, Carissa, was that just like a bonus? Like, well, I'm here, I might as well take a pair of panties.
Right. Well, I think it just shows how deranged he is and how obsessed he is with inappropriate areas of women when he has no right to be there. So he took the underwear, the dirty laundry, the dirty underwear, and a gun, and it's all being linked back to him.
Yeah,
so.
It sort of helps connect the dots, because you hear the testimony from the coworker saying, well, my underwear happened to be missing. We know that they later found it. But yeah, in the past, he had also asked me for it at work. And I sort of brushed it off. He said, can I have a pair of your underwear?
Right, and
no.
Another thing that she brushed off was the fact that there were tracks around her house from a snowmobile.
Right.
And she knew that that was him. She said she knew that he came and cased her house out at times. I don't know why she didn't think that that was really bizarre, or really weird, or worth reporting. But she had a suspicion, and she was able to link it to him by saying, yeah, I know it was him. I know he would ride his snowmobile around my house, and those were his tracks in my driveway.
Yeah.
And that's about the time the gun went missing.
Yeah, exactly. So how will the defense defend against this? We'll be back with more of the closing arguments, and we will be telling you sooner rather than later, what the jury found, the verdict, but not just yet. So stick with us. Wow, that is the defense attorney in the Jeffrey Willis trial. I'm here with Carissa Kranz, who is a Law and Crime Network host. He's just doing a lot of talking, isn't he? He doesn't really have much, and not to mention, he didn't call one witness, not even a character witness who could vouch for this guy as anything other than the way he's been portrayed, which is somebody who's addicted to porn and murder videos.
Right. Well,
and a convicted killer, by the way.
Right. He's a convicted killer, and in his last trial, he testified in his own defense, and that didn't go well. He got a conviction. So this was the state rested, then the defense rested right after their offering their judgment of acquittal, and went straight into closing arguments. And it seems like what he's trying to say is, you have no DNA, you have no evidence, you have no direct evidence, and that's what he is trying to bring home for the jurors to say, we can't prove this case beyond any and all reasonable doubt. But DNA evidence is just one piece of evidence, and yes, it's compelling, but trials were prosecuted way before science was able to prove DNA evidence.
Right, but we also saw a lot of wrongful convictions from that.
Right.
Way back when, right? There were a lot of errors, but I mean, listen, he says, this guy he makes a good point. I mean, this is the one time that I will actually side with the defense, just because, not because I'm saying that I don't think this guy did it, but this is a valid point. It's one of the few valid points we see in the case, right? He says he was a clumsy criminal. So he kept the panties, he kept the gun, he kept the insulin. He even made a joke that this guy had DNA from half of Muskegon, Michigan in that van, but not an ounce of DNA from Jessica Horinga. So you saw DNA from the other victims, from his wife, but not Jessica Horinga. So that's a little bit curious considering that he really didn't make an effort to clean things up or get rid of things. He's driving around with this van with sex toys in it, guns, insulin, I mean, everything you could imagine that would be incriminating. So he wasn't expecting to get caught.
Well, he also had the VIX folder on his computer, and one of the victims named in that folder was Jessica Lynn Harenga's initials, JLH.
Right. Too much of a coincidence.
We found in her grandfather's house tons and tons of bleach and cleaning supply. Yeah, his grandfather's house, tons and tons of bleach and cleaning supplies where he can clean it up. So yes, he may have been clumsy, but I don't think he was that clumsy. The JLH file, the VIX file, was more of a trophy file, not a clumsy mistake. And there was DNA outside the Exxon gas station where she was working that night. A drop of her blood was there. We have an eyewitness placing his van there, or a silver van that a picture of him, a sketch of him, which the defense is arguing doesn't look anything like him, but I'm looking at the sketch, and for people listening in who don't see on the screen, I mean, it's a pretty similar sketch. So when you weigh
you have that silver van description.
You have the silver van description, you have, you know, the gun and the casing that's outside of the gun that was found outside the gas station that night by the drop of blood is linked to the gun that he stole. I mean, there's overwhelming circumstantial evidence to link him to being there, including, if people have been following this, that Taco Bell receipt that was within an hour of her disappearance right across the street.
Right. But what's peculiar about this, and I think this is where the prosecution's lacking, even though you do describe very well the overwhelming evidence against him, there's no body. That's what makes this case so difficult.
Right, and I mean, it makes it difficult because when you have a body, you have more direct, hard evidence to research and play with and work with to figure out what kind of DNA is on the body, what happened to the body, but
especially with the allegations here that this was not just a clean kill. This was a torturous, sexually oriented murder.
Right, and you can't blame a mother for having hope, saying, my daughter's not dead, I'm not accepting this until she's out there somewhere and she's posting it on social media. But
right, Jessica Harenga's mother, just to remind our listeners and our viewers, she has hope that her daughter's still alive.
Right, so there is that argument if the mother can't believe, and a mother knows, right? A mother should have instincts. A mother has an intuition about her own child, you know? So if the mother's having a hard time believing that her own child is dead, and therefore she doesn't think that this guy murdered her,
right,
Jessica, how can the jury think so?
Well, what did the jury think? That's been the big question throughout our coverage, right? So drum roll, please. We are going to go to the verdict. How did the jury rule? Let's play a clip now from the verdict in the Jeffrey Willis trial out of Michigan. Guilty, guilty, guilty. That's how it went. Jeffrey Willis was found guilty by a jury of his peers of first-degree murder, felony murder, and kidnapping. The prosecution completely won this case. It took only an hour and a half to deliberate. Are you surprised they came back that quickly, and are you surprised with the findings?
I'm not surprised that they came back fast. I figured it was going to be a fast verdict. The defense rested. They didn't put on any witnesses. It went straight into closing arguments. All they could try to do was poke holes in the prosecution's case. The prosecution's case was overwhelming circumstantial evidence on why he is guilty. It was based on prior bad acts. If I were sitting on that jury panel, I would come back with a guilty verdict.
Well, I think that was the linchpin. Do you? The fact that he was already convicted of killing Rebecca Blake with this in the same manner. Her name was in that victim's file along with this other one. Everything seems so connected.
Well, and you had a key witness here, Madison Nygaard, who's also a victim.
Exactly.
And he hasn't stood trial yet on her kidnapping, and he held her at gunpoint, but she escaped. So
and she was allowed in.
She survived.
Right.
She testified. She linked it together, and the jurors got to hear from her. So the jurors didn't hear from him, which can't be held against him, but the jurors heard from another victim who survived, and it's really hard to overcome that emotional plea. It's an emotional plea to the jury when you hear a victim on the stand, and then you also heard the woman whose house she ran to talk about the moments right after she escaped from allegedly Jeffrey Willis's silver van. So,
but if his prior murder conviction wasn't allowed in, and if this testimony from this alleged kidnapping victim wasn't allowed in, do you think they would have deliberated and come back so quickly?
No.
Guilty.
I think that if that evidence wasn't allowed in, there wouldn't be enough evidence to prove this case beyond a reasonable
so you
doubt.
actually think he would have been acquitted without those two?
I think he would have gotten away with murder.
Wow.
I think that he's guilty, but I think he would have gotten away with it.
But what about the victim's file? Like you said, the creepy behavior with the coworker, the fact that a manager from the gas station saw Jessica go saw there was a van right when she went missing. There were her blood drops there. What about all that stuff?
I don't think all that would have been linked together without that one victim.
Not even the victim's file that had her name on it on his computer?
I don't think that would have been found as, without the third victim coming forward who survived, which then helped them uncover and close these other cold cases.
Oh, yeah, but I mean, what if that victim wasn't allowed to testify? Do you think they would have had enough?
I think that victim has to testify because you have to link how they got to that point.
Right, it's part of the narrative, right?
I think it's part of the narrative.
Because people are going to wonder, how did you even apprehend this stuff?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they try to appeal.
That's what I was going to ask.
I
so
mean,
those two things, they become the basis for, would you say, a strong appeal? The fact that the prior conviction was let in and this kidnapping victim? No?
I think it's more probative than prejudicial, but I think it is grounds for an appeal, and I think that the defense set themselves up by offering their judgment of acquittal, by wanting to poll the jurors at the end, right after the verdict, that you can bet that there's going to be an appeal.
Right.
But I don't think that it's a valid appeal that is actually going to be overturned. I think that the judge was careful, but he let in evidence that is probative. Yes, it's prejudicial, but it's more probative than prejudicial, and that's what the judge weighed. You have to allow the jurors to the totality of the circumstances, the totality of the evidence. The jurors have to hear all that, and then they have to use common sense and follow the law.
And we just saw a picture of Jeffrey Willis tearing up during his trial, but he did not show any expression when the guilty verdict came in.
No, he seemed to just drop his head a little bit and nod. Yeah, I actually missed him showing some expression, so I didn't even know he was capable of that.
Though he did seem somewhat in good spirits throughout the trial. I mean, he didn't have his head hanging low. He was very involved. He was very engaged. And then you just sort of see nothing from him.
Right. What I'd like to know is if there are other victims, and if once, all these trials are done, if he'll talk. Maybe let us know where the body is.
If he'll give some relief to that mother, because Jessica Oringa's body is still missing. And he's the only one who knows where it is.
Right, and he's already been found guilty. So once they're done maybe with the appeals and the sentencing phase, I mean, he might be able to, I don't know if he'd be facing the death penalty or not with two.
It's a mandatory life in prison without parole.
For 2 murders?
Yeah, so he's already got the life sentence with the Rebecca Blake conviction, and now he's going to face another life sentence without parole.
So this is not a
back-to-back life. Right, so there'll be a sentencing on June 12th, but it's a mandatory life in prison without parole.
So he has no incentive to really disclose or try to mitigate. It would be helpful if he could. I bet there's other victims. I bet there are other victims.
But also you're expecting, like you said, remorse from somebody who committed these acts.
No, not remorse.
Unless, you're saying if there's no incentive, right? If there's no way to get out of this life without parole, then what are the chances that he's going to show compassion for the families, unless he does feel regret for what he's done?
I don't think he's going to feel regret. But if it's, if he can't get a death penalty and he can't have any, anything else really harm him, he's already life in prison. Maybe once the appeals are done, if he actually started talking, I bet he would take. These are trophy victims. Okay, it's not about remorse or feeling guilty as much as now he can take. He's already life in prison, right? But not yet, because I'm sure there's going to be pending appeals. He can't talk.
Right.
He can't
unless
talk
he goes through an awakening, some sort of a religious awakening in prison.
Yeah,
it happens sometimes. But now we know that a jury did find Jeffrey Willis guilty of first-degree murder, felony murder, and kidnapping of Jessica Oringa, whose body has never been found. A 25-year-old mother from Michigan who went missing, had a young child, so obviously a tragedy all around. We're going to take a quick break, and we will be back with more coverage. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and to our Sirius XM listeners. We're going to switch gears now, as we just told you the verdict in the Jeffrey Willis trial out of Michigan. He was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Jessica Haringa. He had previously been convicted of the first-degree murder of Rebecca Blake. And so now he faces back-to-back life sentences, mandatory life sentences in Michigan without the possibility of parole. Let's switch gears to another trial out of Florida that's pretty similar, actually. Shawn Grate, a serial killer, also convicted of 2 murders and a kidnapping. The penalty phase starts tomorrow. But there was a kidnapping victim that escaped. And there was a very dramatic 911 call that captured it all. So let's take a listen. And that was a very dramatic 911 call from a woman who actually was able to escape from Shawn Grate. She had been locked in with him in this location across from a laundromat. It was some sort of a room that he had her in, where he was repeatedly raping her until she finally had the courage to call 911. And you can see how quickly, Carissa Kranz, you're here, host here at Law and Crime Network, you could see how quickly the police responded. I mean, it seemed like they were there within a minute or two.
Right. And, you know, we just jumped back from the last trial, and now we're jumping into this one. Isn't it interesting, the parallels? Like,
absolutely.
Both of them have a kidnapped victim that survived, which then led to the findings of two other dead people.
Right.
So,
and so you,
really
this guy
overlap.
suspected serial killer, the other guy suspected serial killer, and it's the kidnapping victim, like you said, that survives, that leads them to find this guy and all these other victims. Right. I mean, horrifically, in this one, they end up finding victims there. I mean, there's one in
bodies
the basement, bodies,
in the house,
exactly. There's one in the closet, maggots. It's very disturbing. So there's no question there who did it, right? In terms of the bodies. But listen, they've still got to go through the process, the due process, and bring out all of the evidence.
So the difference is in this case, this one's a death penalty state. So the last case,
this is in Ohio.
Right.
Yes.
So this one's in Ohio. It's a death penalty state. The last case we just discussed in Michigan, they're both guilty of killing 2 people or more, 2 known people. But in Willis's case, he's only going to be facing 2 life sentences, like you said, that were mandatory. And in this case, Shawn Grate could be facing the death penalty, and that's where we're at with the sentencing phase. Yeah,
and I think it's more likely because we know that it's an aggravating factor if you're a serial killer, right? If you're killing multiple victims.
And you have the aggravating factor of the violent sexual acts.
Exactly.
Which on the sentencing score sheets make it worse for him.
Yeah, you have multiple aggravating factors here, and like you said, the jury really got a taste of how violent it was from that testimony from the surviving kidnapping victim. But it was chilling to listen to that call because you feel like you're there and you feel like it's in seconds this guy could wake up and it could all be over for her. It's almost like a rush for the police to get there. And when they finally get there, I found myself just breathing a sigh of relief, like, oh, they're there. She's safe. You know, it's just your heart races because he's there, and it's so risky to be making a call. And this is something we see time and time again in real life scenarios, but also in the movies, you know, where people are like, is now the time where I go for my escape, where I try to get out.
She had nothing to lose. She was in that house. She was trapped in that house. There were 2 other dead bodies in that house. She knew she was next. So if she had any moment or any chance of escape for survival, that was it. And that was it. And, you know, she was going to end up dead anyway.
And she
had nothing
about
to
that.
lose.
Yeah, she talked about that in the testimony about the way she tried to survive. That when she was trying to resist the rapes, he was strangling her so tightly that she felt that he would choke her to death. So she just, you know, she gave in. So she allowed herself to be continuously raped over the course of those days because she knew she had to do that to survive. But for some reason at that moment, she felt, okay, you know, just being submissive may not make me make it out alive in the end, right? Now I've got to sort of get out.
She's smart. She's smart and she's brave.
Yes.
You know, and even living through this and reliving through, you know, being a part of the sentencing phase is it's not allowing her to move on and move forward. She's having to relive it for the jury to live it. She's got to relive it. And sometimes, like, you know, these escape victims are all the testimony that you're going to have because the other victims are dead. They don't
and all
get
the
to tell their
testimony you
story.
need sometimes, right? Because like you said, it's so compelling.
It's so compelling, and it links everything together.
Yeah, and so what's really interesting about this is she didn't even really know her address or location. She just knew a landmark. There's a laundromat across the street. So let's listen to a clip of Sergeant Jim Cox, who was part of that rescue team, describe how they found her and found her so quickly without an exact location.
So let's say.
Wow, so that was Sergeant Jim Cox, who was part of the rescue team that got this rape victim who survived out of Shawn Grate's house of horrors, so to speak. And all she does is she's able to untie herself because she was bound and run and call 911. And all she tells them is that she's across from a laundry, a laundry mart on a certain street. But they get there and they see two houses that look very similar and they don't know which one it is. And if you're thinking about this, Carissa, they have seconds really before this guy could wake up and kill her in the heat of the moment. If they can't find her in time, she's dead, right? So luckily, what happens? They're able to spot her somehow.
Through the window. Through the window. There were two houses right next to each other, and they were able to spot her through the window and piece it together. Obviously, someone was looking out for her to help her because he slept through this. He slept through all of this. Yep. I can't believe she was able to get untied, get on the phone, get to a window, and tiptoe around a house where there are already two other dead bodies decaying, and and have him sleeping in a bedroom this entire time while the officers are pulling their guns and making entry. It's quite a heroic story.
Absolutely. She really lucked out. Let's listen to some more of the testimony from Sergeant Jim Cox when he describes finally finding her and pulling her to safety. So this is the Shawn Grate trial out of Ohio, and that was Sergeant Jim Cox, part of the rescue team. They got a 911 call from a woman who had been kidnapped, raped repeatedly for days. She was courageous enough to free herself while her attacker was sleeping. This man, Shawn Grate, she called 911. They got there within minutes, and Sergeant Jim Cox was describing that miraculous rescue. We know Grate was convicted of 2 murders. They later found the bodies. We will play that amazing testimony of how the officers found those bodies. But I want to talk about how the trial went first, because we know that midway through, Shawn Grate did this sort of surprising move where he pled guilty to, I think it was 15 out of 23 counts, including 4 counts of rape with sexually violent predator specifications. But he would not plead to 4 charges of aggravated murder, 3 counts of kidnapping, and aggravated robbery. So why?
Well, that's defense strategy. So if the best evidence is always video evidence, picture evidence, things that you can directly prove. The prosecution had videos of the defendant, Shawn Grate, actually raping violently these victims. So
2 of the victims, Stacey Stanley and Jane Doe.
Right. So it was a defense tactic to keep that evidence out of the jurors' eyes. The last things the defense needed was the jury to take back to that room of deliberations and replay this violent sexual rape video in his house. And then, oh my gosh, the dead bodies are found there too. So they were better off saying, you know what, I'm going to plead to this. This isn't relevant. This is prejudicial. This isn't relevant to prove the murder. I'm going to plead guilty to these 15 counts, and then the remaining 8 need to be tried. Can the prosecution prove its case with relevant evidence?
Okay, I can see that, but he's admitting that he raped these women. So whether you have a video showing that he raped the women and he's later convicted of raping them, or he pleads guilty to raping them, yes, they don't have that violent imagery in their head like you said, but they found the bodies, right? So he's saying, I'm a rapist. The bodies are in his home. What more do you need?
Well, I think if they saw that video, the jurors would not have deliberated a few hours to find him guilty of murder. They would have deliberated about 15 minutes.
Probably.
I mean,
because it's traumatic.
It's traumatic
to watch.
And to see that kind of deranged behavior with a defendant that's standing trial, and then you find the dead bodies, it's so much worse. A video really evokes emotions and would paint him out to be an evil monster, which he already is.
He was, right. And so here's an interesting twist. The Ashland County Common Pleas Judge Ron Forthafall, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, asked Grate why he chose to change his plea. And keep in mind, as you said, there was this video of Stacy Stanley and Jane Doe, the kidnapping victim that we heard on that 911 tape. There were videos of him raping her, too, the one that survived. And he said to keep it from rubbing it in her face anymore. So actually, Shawn Grate was showing a little conscience there, a little remorse there, saying that he didn't want this victim to watch these videos of herself being raped. We'll be back right after this with more of the Shawn Grate trial out of Ohio, so please stick with us. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and to our Sirius XM listeners. Thank you for joining us. We are following this trial out of Ohio, Shawn Grate. There's actually already been a conviction, but the penalty phase will start tomorrow. He was convicted of 2 murders and a kidnapping. We were talking about how he pled to 15 of 23 counts during the trial, including raping 2 of the victims. But he wouldn't plead to the murders initially. But the reason, Carissa Kranz, a host here at Law and Crime Network, the reason you're saying that he pled is because there were these damning videos of him raping one of the women whose body was found in his apartment and also a surviving victim. And I told you before the break, he explained to the judge his reasoning. He actually said he didn't want to rub this video in the surviving victim's face. What do you make of that from somebody who was convicted of killing 2 people? The bodies were found in his home decaying.
He didn't want it rubbed in his face anymore. And that was his way of not admitting that he doesn't have the manhood that he would like to have, because he has to go rape. He's got to go rape someone to get what he wants. He's not just getting it on his own.
But was that an inkling of remorse, do you think?
No.
No.
I think he didn't want it rubbed in his face anymore. I think that the murders are trophies to him, but the rape is not. But he's deranged, and he gets off on that kind of sexual behavior, and then strangling the life out of and the light out of the eyes of his victims. But he didn't want it rubbed in his own face anymore. And he knows that if those videos came in as evidence, that those videos were going to be replayed and replayed and replayed, and he would have definitely been toast. He's toast anyway.
He was toast anyway.
But
let's listen to Sergeant Jim Cox, who rescued that rape and kidnapping victim, describe how he found Shawn Grate, because we know he was sleeping, and miraculously the cops got there, and I think he was still asleep. So let's listen. So that's Sergeant Jim Cox describing after he rescued this kidnapping victim. I'm here with Law and Crime Network host Carissa Kranz, who's joining me today to do this analysis. And so they're talking about how they came upon this guy. He's sleeping, right? So he probably doesn't know what hit him.
Nope, she got away with it. She's escaped, and she tiptoed around him and called the cops and unleashed herself and stood in the window and helped the cops sort of gain entry. And you just heard him talking about the flies and the insects, and it's no wonder that Ashland wants to demolish that house. I mean, just think about all the bad energy and the bad vibes and the bad juju that's in there.
Oh, absolutely. And we now know that they found 2 decaying bodies.
Yeah, decaying. It's
maggots, flies. I mean, the bodies are in there while he is raping and trying to create another murder victim, but luckily she escaped. But there's no better person to explain it than Sergeant Jim Cox, because he found the bodies. I mean, I just can't even imagine coming upon decaying bodies in the closet. So let's listen to what he has to say. So first you heard from Sergeant Jim Cox, then you heard from Agent Ed Staley, because what they discovered was really horrific and disturbing. This was 2 bodies that were in, one was in the closet, and then there was another one. They found a human foot and a leg belonging to Elizabeth Griffith. Here with Carissa Kranz, who's a host for the Law and Crime Network. Wow, that's incriminating evidence, right? It doesn't get more incriminating than that, does it? The actual bodies found decaying in the closet.
Yep, this time we have DNA and dead bodies. If you were following us earlier this morning, we were talking about another trial where he was found guilty with no dead body. Here we have 2 dead bodies, parts of the bodies decaying. It's really gruesome. It's really gross. You have maggots, you have flies, you have insects. Yuck.
And it begs the question, why? Like, why? I mean, I can understand. Yeah, it's hard to put yourself in the mind of a serial killer, but if you're going to bring more people into that apartment, let alone the guys living there. Okay, so that adds another level of derangement.
Right. These are his trophies. That's why he pled guilty to the rape. He didn't want that rubbed in his face. He said he didn't want it rubbed in the victim's face anymore, but he didn't want it rubbed in his face because he really takes pride in the trophy of the dead body. Those are
But
his
do you
trophies.
think, was there something logistical about this? I mean, I'm just trying to put myself in this guy's shoes, as impossible as it may be. He's raped and brutally tortured and killed these bodies. Is the safest place for them, meaning the place where people are least likely to find them, in his apartment where he lives? He can at least control who has access.
Well, how long have those bodies really been there? I think a couple weeks to a month, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he was on a killing spree, and that was also used as an intimidation tactic for the victim that actually escaped. And that's why she became so brave when she took the phone and unleashed herself and, risked her life waiting for the cops to get there, because she knew she had nothing to lose. Can you imagine what that house smelled like?
Well,
I mean,
that's what he said.
This
Ed Staley, this agent, said it was just deplorable. It was such a significant odor that people who went into there, they couldn't bear to smell it. So how did this guy live there?
Well, I'm sure we can't even imagine what it would smell like. I mean, what does two dead human bodies in a house cooped up smell like? I mean, how awful, how horrific. And
they're covered in clothes, as if that's going to mask anything.
No.
Look ridiculous. So, we're going to toss to a quick break right now, but when we come back, we will have more about the Shawn Grate trial. He was already convicted of killing 2 people, their bodies found decaying, one of them in the closet. There was a kidnapping victim who survived. She had been raped repeatedly, and she miraculously freed herself and called 911. And that's what led to the discovery of these other 2 bodies. So please stay with us, all our Sirius XM listeners, as well as our Law and Crime Network viewers, as we come back and play more clips from this amazing trial of this convicted serial killer. So welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. Again, you are listening to testimony of Agent Ed Staley, and he came upon this house of horrors where Shawn Grate had killed and kept the bodies of his victims, had entrapped a young girl that he met at Bible study. Let's sort of talk about that. I'm here with Carissa Kranz. This duality in his personality, where he presents himself to this young girl that he meets at a resource center as a religious, faithful person, and lures her in, grooms her with this Bible study that they connect over. And it's not like she met this guy and just went to his house with him. I mean, they had developed a relationship. So he's obviously able to put on the appearance of, look, I'm the guy next door. I'm harmless. I'm your friend. And then all of a sudden, she even described it in her testimony, he snaps. And he's a monster, and he bounds her to the bed and is viciously raping her for days. What is he a sociopath? Is he a psychopath? I mean,
yes, he's all of those things. He's a sociopath. He's a psychopath. He's
pretty
deranged.
obvious, right?
But this isn't the first time we've heard news stories where people who are religious or even pastors are one way, and then you find out they have all these demons and that they're monsters underneath, and they take advantage of children. They take advantage of their status in their profession and use that in their favor to gain the trust of the soon-to-be victim. So it's very hard to get into the mind of a serial rapist and serial killer who went on a killing spree. But I think you said it right when you said this is a house of horrors. Yeah. I mean, you don't even know what you're getting into. And I think this goes to just life. You don't know someone until you know someone. And you don't know what someone's capable of until they show you. And this victim, the one that got away, she trusted him. She had no idea. And then he snapped, and she entered that house of horrors. She was surrounded by decaying dead bodies. She was violently raped. And she had a heroic escape because, you know what? She had no choice.
Yeah, and I wonder how she was able to get these bindings off, because Agent Ed Staley sort of went into a lot of detail about all these bindings and restraints that he found for each of the extremities that were just tied around the wrists and the legs. I mean, it seems like this guy had his pattern down, and he had previous victims, which we know, and he had videos of what he had done to them. So the jury wasn't able to see that because he pled guilty to the rapes to prevent the jurors from seeing that. But we know that he sort of had a modus operandi, right?
Yes, a modus operandi, a common scheme, a common plan. And that, by actually keeping out the videos, it it kept the jury from seeing some of this direct evidence proving this common scheme or plan, but through testimony and through the other victims and through the surviving victim, the prosecution was able to prove beyond any and all reasonable doubt, because we're in the sentencing phase now, he was found guilty, that he had a common scheme or plan and was guilty of these crimes. And in this case, you know, we had 2 dead bodies, even though he pled guilty to the rape and the video wasn't allowed in as evidence, which would have proven, you know, I mean, video's best evidence. I mean, they had him on camera. That was part of his trophies, part of his files of, you know, what he's recording. He wants it documented. He's that sick, he's that deranged that he wants to document, you know, his status as a serial killer and a serial rapist.
Yeah, so it makes you think that that was the dominant part of his personality, right? That maybe the Bible study was more of just a ruse to get his victims there, like you said, to gain their trust or to groom them or what have you, to lure them in so that they were unsuspecting, rather than this is a guy who really is a faithful person but has this dark side, and he's sort of struggling to balance the two, and then all of a sudden, sort of like Dexter, like one wins over when he's not expecting it, and he snaps and he goes into serial killer mode.
Right. Well, and there's no testimony from him that he thought that God made him do this or that God was telling him to do this. Because if there was something like that, then he would have had a defense that may have survived of insanity or temporary insanity. But he was found to be legally competent and legally sane for this trial. So he pled guilty. He was competent to plead guilty to the rape, and then the jurors found him guilty of the murders. And now, I mean, he's talking that there are other victims, and I believe him. I believe there are other victims.
Yeah, so here's the thing. I mean, why not? First of all, why talk about other victims? Why do you think?
Because
you've
credit.
You've been
It's a
saying that
trophy.
over and over, that it's the trophy, and he's sort of compiling these victims, and it's like a victory.
Right, and you know,
he's building a reputation.
And what I suspect is if he gets the death penalty, which we don't know what's going to happen, but this is a death penalty state, so I think it's very likely that he's going to get the death penalty. If he gets the death penalty and he has nothing to lose, expect him to talk. We're going to get a whole bunch of other cold cases closed, and he's going to tell us about his other trophies and victims. We're going to hear about it.
Why is that? Because he wants to go down in history
Yes.
as the serial
Yes.
killer who did this.
Yes.
So what, I mean, you've probably heard about these other serial killer cases. We all have. Right? We watch these documentaries, real life documentaries, and all the different crime shows. What differentiates this guy, would you say, from, is there an average serial killer? Is there some, I mean, besides the number of victims that he's racking up?
Well, I think he's already won in his mind. He already has a Wikipedia page for being a serial killer. If you Google Shawn Grate, there he is on Wikipedia. He's gone down in history. Even if he gets the death penalty, he is now written in history on Wikipedia as a serial killer. He's now famous. He is known for this. So, yeah, he wants credit.
Okay, so the sick, deranged, aspiring serial killer will be back with more testimony from that trial. He's already been convicted, but he faces the penalty phase starting tomorrow. So stay with us, please. We're going to throw to a quick commercial break. So some more of the sordid details from Agent Ed Staley, who responded and helped rescue a victim. And then they're in Shawn Grate's house, a guy who's supposedly faithful, religious, doing Bible study until he starts raping and kidnapping and entrapping this victim. And Carissa Kranz, host here with Law and Crime Network, what did they find after they rescued this woman?
2 other dead bodies, body parts, flies, insects, maggots, clothes strung everywhere, clothes on top of the bodies to try to hide the smell and to try to hide it. An awful decaying odor in the house, and proof beyond any and all reasonable doubt that the torture, the sexual crimes, and the murders all occurred in that house. The House of Horrors. I like when you said that earlier.
Because besides from this being like a real-life cemetery almost, where he was burying his victims
exactly
under
what it was.
mounds of clothes.
I mean, and not only
it's
that.
also a torture chamber, isn't it?
It's a torture chamber, and it was a killing spree. And while he's now admitting to other victims, these 3 victims were all within a month time period. It was a short time period. He went on a spree, and he intended to kill this last one that got away.
And potentially more. Right? There may not have been an end in sight if she had not gotten away.
No, this is someone that this is how he thrives. This is what gets him going. This is what he lives for. He lives to see his victims die.
and to torture them slowly. It's difficult to talk about, but they did find these restraints, they were bound to different areas, the bedpost and different areas of the place. And then, like we talked about before, he videotaped it, and he had these sex toys propped up against the wall with condoms on the ends of them. So we know from the testimony of that kidnapping victim who survived that she was tortured and raped repeatedly for days.
Right, but he pled guilty to that.
He did. He pled guilty to that, so we wouldn't see the video. We also wouldn't see the video of him raping another poor victim. And
that's strategic defense work right there. Keep the video away from the eyes of the jury.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what he did, but it really didn't seem to matter. He was convicted. But here's the question I have about that video. So the video stayed out of the trial because he pled, right? Would it be able to come in to the penalty phase as an aggravating factor?
Yes. Yes, the rules of evidence for penalty phase and sentencing is a lot more lenient. Things like even hearsay is admissible in sentencing phases. So it'll be interesting to see what comes in and what, if any, testimony or evidence the defense offers to try to mitigate his sentence or to not take the death penalty, or if maybe he thrives off death so much that he'll just accept his own fate and kind of want it. I don't know. How do we get into the head of someone like this? How do we understand what he's really thinking about?
And he said, of course, that the reason he didn't want those videos admitted is because he didn't want the surviving victim to have to watch herself being raped. You didn't buy into that excuse, obviously.
No, I think it's not that he didn't want to rub it in the victim's face. He didn't want it rubbed in his own face anymore, that's the only way he was able to get any. He has to tie a woman up and hold her against his will and use her, and then he has to kill her to silence her. So he's taking pride. Yeah, he's taking pride in the killings. Those are his trophies. Those dead bodies. He's not taking pride in the rape. So keeping that away from the jurors were twofold. One, he pled guilty because it was already on video. He was going to be found guilty. He didn't want to see that. He didn't want it rubbed in his face that he's found guilty of rape. He wanted to be done with that. Plead guilty, end that chapter, not bring it up again.
Well, because obviously he's going to be found guilty, right?
Obviously,
if you're going to watch the video, you're going to find him guilty.
He's
like, just find me guilty without watching the video.
Just find me guilty. But let's go on with the murders because he wants to relive that.
Oh, you think so?
He wants to relive
that. Well, that's a twist. That's a twisted twist.
No, he wants to relive the murders. He's living for these murders, and now he's behind bars, and when's he going to get to relive a murder again? The only time he gets to relive it is while it is being taken day by day, moment by moment in front of a jurors with witnesses reliving and recounting so he can get his thrill. And that's why there's going to be other victims, because he's going to want to recount his thrill. For as long as this man is alive, he is going to want to feel the thrill of the kill.
Well, because one would wonder, why is he bragging about there being other victims if they haven't been found yet?
But new cases are now reopening.
Right.
And he will solve those cases, and he will talk. Especially
to feed his serial killer ego, you're saying?
Especially if he's going to get the death penalty. He's got nothing to lose at that point.
Now, let me ask you, though, with those rape videos, when he pled guilty, do those automatically come in if the prosecutor wants to into the penalty phase as an aggravating factor to try to get the death penalty, or will a judge have to decide, whether these are prejudicial or probative? Is it the same standard? You said it's more relaxed in the aggravating penalty phase.
I don't think anything's automatic. The defense can object to whatever they want, but violent acts, sexual predatory acts, is something that the judge is going to want to consider for a sentencing score sheet. So a jury is going to come back and they're going to make a recommendation. And they're either going to say death penalty or not, and then it's up to the judge to enforce it. So, in this case, it would make sense that victims in sentencing phase. So a sentencing phase is a mini trial.
Right, where you have aggravating and mitigating factors.
Yeah, and you have witnesses, and you have evidence, and you have testimony, but it's more relaxed. Hearsay is going to be allowed in. Things that may have been held out before the trial in a motion in limine. A motion in limine is saying, we don't. This won't be admissible. That won't be admissible. This is prejudicial. This is more prejudicial than probative. I object. I object. So things that were held out in a motion in limine may actually be allowed in a sentencing phase, because this is when the judge is going to enforce a sentence. So if the jurors comes back with a unanimous recommendation of the death penalty,
right.
All all of these things can be considered.
Yeah.
And they can also be considered on an appeal.
Yeah, and I think really just to put it in a nutshell for the viewers and listeners, the determination comes down to, yes, there are aggravating factors in terms of the age of the victim. Sometimes, it depends state to state, or the way in which they were killed, or how many victims, which is something we see here, more than one victim. But I think really one of the major aggravating factors, which you can kind of infer here, is that this was atrocious, heinous, cruel behavior that led to this killing, that there was suffering. Because we see that with the kidnapping victim. We see how she was raped, how she was tortured, and the presumption is she was going to be another victim. So perhaps that's the way that the other two died. Can jurors make that inference?
Yes, and I think what's just really sad about this case is there's really nothing you can do to rehabilitate someone like this. They're obviously not a productive member of society. They're never going to be. They have a history of this. So is it better to sentence them to death, or is it better to put them behind bars and spend the rest of their life suffering, thinking about what they did? But even if he's behind bars thinking about what he did, I don't think he's someone that will ever feel remorseful. He will go around jail bragging about what he accomplished, and he'll probably be comparing notes with other criminals behind bars and seeing...
Which has an inherent danger in itself.
Right. He's
to spread the information,
he's a dangerous human being. He is a dangerous human being, and the question is does it cost more money to keep him alive? And
for what purpose?
And for what purpose? Some states have death penalty, states. Other states are not death penalty states at all.
But that will also come in too, right? If he's got family members or friends who are like, listen, keep him alive for us. There's somebody out here who cares about this man.
Yeah, all of that gets to come in. All of that gets to come in. And certain states, have done away with the death penalty no matter how awful somebody is and how heinous their crimes are, because it costs the state more money to try these cases and appeal these cases and to actually execute and complete the death penalty.
Absolutely.
So.
And again, one of the aggravating factors is more than one victim. There was a second body found in that house. We will listen to the circumstances and the people that discovered it after this quick commercial break. And so there was a crawl space and a hole in the basement, and that's where they found this second body. Quite the gruesome scene. I mean, these law enforcement officers, I should say, Carissa Kranz, she's a host here at Law&Crime Network, they're pretty courageous themselves, right? Because this is their life. They have to live and, unfortunately, breathe these types of discoveries.
Breathe is key evidence in this case. Walking into a house with two dead bodies and then a victim who's being tortured while the perpetrator is upstairs sleeping. So yes, these officers take their lives into their hands every day. I mean, they're walking into a house. They don't know what they're walking into. They're walking into a landmine of dead bodies. They're walking into a cemetery in that house, and a cemetery where bodies are buried in clothes.
Yeah, and they found a young lady, Stacy Stanley Hicks. That was the second victim. The first body that they found upstairs in the closet, Shawn Grate's closet, was Elizabeth Griffith. These were two women who had been presumably raped, tortured, and then killed. He was convicted of the killings, but there was a video of him raping Stacy Stanley Hicks, so we know that. It was not admitted to the jury. But, good thing they had the foresight, and I guess this is obviously part of their training. They find one body. You know what? It's sick, but they're thinking, what else is here? Right? So they're on the hunt for something else. So they sort of make it to this basement, and they see that there is a stairway leading down to the basement and a human hand with jewelry and bracelets. And, I mean, they're finding body parts scattered throughout because the body's decaying, so it's not fully intact.
Right. Yep, they're finding that, and now he's talking about, and it's being discussed, that there's other dead bodies that exist besides the ones that were found that day.
Yeah.
So this guy is on the warpath, and he needs to be taken off the streets, behind bars, and maybe could be facing the death penalty because Ohio is a death penalty state. So
yeah, and you brought it up. There are other bodies, he says, but is it true, and where are they? Let's listen to a clip of this law enforcement agent as he discovered the second body. Maybe it will provide some clues. So these horrible details about the second body that was found, Stacy Stanley Hicks, she was partially dressed, according to this law enforcement agent. The lower half, she had one boot on. and then the rest of her lower body was clothed. I'm here with Carissa Kranz, who's a Law&Crime host. That's kind of bizarre how she was only partially dressed with one boot on.
Wasn't the whole thing bizarre?
Yeah.
I mean, he's got,
without a doubt,
he's got 3 victims in the house. He's tying them up. He's mutilating them. He's raping them. He's killing them, and he's leaving them there. He's not even trying to dispose them. He's too busy going to get his next victim rather than dispose of the current victim.
Yeah. And there was a ligature still around her neck, so it's not like he treated the bodies with any type of honorability or respect or decency afterwards.
But he did go to church.
Yeah, exactly.
He's a churchgoer.
Yeah, but you have like this, it's almost like a mutilation, right, of the corpse. And that's also can be charged as well when you are so disrespectful of the body. Because here's why. You have family members and friends who want to receive their loved one when that person has passed and bury them with dignity. And so when you mutilate a corpse, that becomes a legal charge, right?
Right. But I think at this point that he had so many more egregious charges against him that he's already facing the death penalty. But all of that can be considered in the sentencing phase. A mutilated corpse should be brought up by the prosecution. I mean, there's
well, because it shows the way in which the person died, right?
Right.
The torturous, heinous, slow, painful way.
Painful death.
Right.
Painful death. So we'll see if he wants that. If he wants the death penalty for himself, or if he brings up, you know.
Well, we saw that before, right? We just saw that in the Cherish Periwinkle case. That was a little girl that was raped and killed, and he seemed to want the death penalty.
Right.
He did not put up any type of a defense or any mitigating factors, and wanted to die.
Because to them, death is living. That they live for death. They live to die. They live to kill.
It's interesting you say that because they're killing, right? They're killing people.
They're like a vampire. That's how they live. That's how they feed. He's feeding. So, and he'll continue to relive his deaths. And the only way, we'll see what he does if he tries to strike any kind of deal to get out of the death penalty by disclosing and closing other cold cases, or if he says doesn't try to defend himself and says he accepts his fate of the death penalty, which he might, and then he still may volunteer to close the cases so he can get credit for these other trophy dead bodies, which right now he's claiming there are about 5, and he already has his Wikipedia page if you Google him on the internet. So I'm sure he wants to go down in history as a serial rapist and a serial killer. Maybe not a rapist, but he is a rapist, but he wants to go down as a serial killer. He's taking pride in this, and he wants his Wikipedia page to memorialize his awful, heinous, grotesque acts.
Yeah, and as horrific as these discoveries are, if you look at it from a more sterile standpoint, if that's even the right word, what law enforcement is doing now really logistically is collecting evidence, right? Because each sex toy, each condom, each bruise, each ligature that's found, these are all clues, it's all evidence as to how these victims died, basically, and at whose hands. And even though it might be obvious, because you find dead bodies in this guy's house, okay, to the common person, he did it, they still have to meet certain legal elements and they still have to build a case. So let's listen to some more of the description of these law enforcement officers, what they found and how they started the collection process. So you can see all those markings on Shawn Grate's body. There was a cut by his knuckles. I'm here with Carissa Kranz. So we see bloody cuts, and I mean, are these the markings, the clawings of his victims trying to defend themselves and get away?
Or it's part of the sexual torture in the videos that we haven't seen. I mean, we don't know what
That's another possibility.
Right. I mean, he's chaining people up. There probably was a struggle. You know, the victim that survived, you know, she said that she was submissive in order to survive. So those markings could be clawings. They could be evidence of a struggle, or it could be from, he may get off on that S&M type of, who knows what those videos actually really show.
Right, so it could be on the one hand that the victims are making these marks on him, and these are sort of defensive wounds, right? But it could be on the other hand, it could say that he said he punched one of the victims and hit his knuckle on her tooth.
Right.
So on the other hand, it's him inflicting harm, physical harm, and torture on them.
Right. So these are his wounds and his scars are or tattoos showing that he, he committed these acts. But the question is, I mean, how much more evidence do we really need? I mean, at this point, it's just painting a picture of what a monster this guy is, a narrative of how awful he is.
Well, that's why we say when we're covering these trials, I mean, some of the trials, they get into such extensive detail. And I'm wondering, do you always need to go to those lengths to establish something? I get the idea of we've got to establish something in a court. We've got to establish a direct connection, right? Or we've got to establish the expert nature of this witness, right? But then sometimes, for example, if you have an expert on the stand and they're going through their resume, it takes like 20 minutes for them to describe all their accomplishments. And the same thing with evidence. The bodies are there. How much do we have to link him to them? How much is too much?
Well, I guess the lawyers are doing their job. They're zealously advocating for their clients. They're building their case. They're making their narrative. But in a case like this, I mean, this is made for TV, or radio for people that are listening. But the people that are listening don't have the benefit of the pictures that we just saw.
Right.
We saw the pictures. We saw the markings. We saw the scratches. We saw the knuckles. We saw the healing marks. We saw the crevice in his fingers where the blood was, obviously scabbing. I mean,
and his whole back was filled with marks. Bloody marks.
And he may like that. That might be something
it might be
he
part
enjoys.
of the whole sexual
That might
escapades.
It could be part. Yes, it could be part of his entire modus operandi.
Yeah, exactly.
Common plan and scheme.
Yeah, but what remains, what we haven't really talked at length about, we went into the discovery of the bodies, the escape of this woman who was kidnapped and raped and tortured for days. But what about the two women that did not escape? We know they were found dead, their bodies decomposing in this guy's home. It looked like there had been some sexual activity going on there, that they were also raped, that they were also tortured. But how did they come in contact with him? That's the question. We know that the woman who escaped, she had gotten in contact with him through a local resource center. They had done Bible study together. She had known him for quite a while. They had developed a trusting relationship, and that's when she went back to his home, and all of a sudden she described it as he just totally snapped, pulled the Bible out of her hands and said, "You're not going anywhere." I mean, it's straight out of a movie. Really scary stuff. But what about Stacey Hicks and Elizabeth Griffith, the two women that were not lucky enough to make it out alive? Let's listen to a man who worked at a gas station where he saw Stacey Hicks and Grate came in, and he can shed some light on what happened leading up to this murder. So you can hear from that testimony of that gas station clerk that one of these victims, Stacey Stanley and Shawn Grate, her convicted murderer, they were talking before. It's not like he grabbed her and with the way that we heard where the kidnapping victim who survived, it's not like he all of a sudden like sprung himself upon her. He had a relationship with her because something happened with her car and he was helping her out. But it continued because they were talking, chit-chatting. They got coffee for one another. They left together. So obviously she felt safe with this guy, even though she presumably didn't know him very well.
Yeah, he seems to be really good at getting women to gain trust with him, and then when they're trapped and he has them isolated behind closed doors, that's it, they're trapped and they really can't get away. He's in a different position of power at that point. And
he's like a Jekyll and Hyde type. And you were talking about how it's scary to think, but it's true. A lot of times we hear about these crimes happening when people are stranded on the side of the road, men and women.
Yeah.
But it's really like a crime of opportunity.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, you can't plan when you're going to be stranded changing a tire, or when you're going to run out of gas, or when you're going to be jogging and some creep is driving up and says, "Oh, that victim kind of matches my type."
Right.
And
it's vulnerable right now.
Yeah,
needs help.
And I'm gonna seize the moment. It's a crime of opportunity, like you said. It's not really premeditated. It's not something or it's not always premeditated. It can be, but it's not something that you can always plan, as much as they're on the prowl.
Right, but what you see here is not that, he pulls up on the side of a stranded road and throws her in the vehicle. What you see here is that he's out and about in front of people with her. He's not scared to be spotted, right?
Well, it's like luring a child with candy, right? You're gaining their trust. You're getting them out of purview or the public eye where you could get caught. You're getting them into your close quarters, where then you can close the door and that's
turn into
it.
a different person.
Then you can become the monster.
Because
like
she got in the car. You're seeing that these women willingly, even the kidnapping victim, willingly went to the house. They're willingly going with him. We're going to throw to a quick commercial break, and then we'll come back and we'll hear testimony from that victim who survived, the one you heard earlier in the 911 call. So she's describing how she met Shawn Grate. This is a girl who was eventually trapped in his apartment, raped, kidnapped, but she ended up surviving. She was able to break free while he was sleeping and call 911, and they were there within minutes. It was really an amazing phone call where she describes how he's sleeping, where she is, but she doesn't have an exact address. They're able to see her through a window and basically rescue her before he wakes up. But she's sort of describing how she became acquainted with him and endeared to him in a sense. Carissa Kranz is here with me. She's a new host here at the Law and Crime Network. And she describes him as coming off as goofy and kind. Meanwhile, in the closet, he's a serial killer. How do you make sense of that?
Well, he's got skeletons in the closet, right?
Exactly. Good saying.
So that's a common trait for serial killers. They can come off as very charming and very manipulative. They want to gain the victim's trust, so the victim is disarmed, and then the victim puts themselves into a vulnerable situation, where then they can't get out of it, and then they turn. Then it is that Jekyll and Hyde effect. The monster comes out. I mean, other common serial traits, and they don't have to have all of them, but they definitely share a lot of the same characteristics. Besides being charming and manipulative, it's the need to control, the need to isolate, poor impulse control, the inability to feel remorse, wanting to take credit for it, have trophies. Shawn Grate.
Does this psychological analysis come into the trial at all, or are we past that? Do we not even need to explain to these jurors the mind of a serial killer? Because listen, there are two dead bodies. It's like, draw your inferences for yourself. Or would that help if you bring it in?
I think that part of the reason why they're painting the picture for the jury in this kind of depth is because this is a death penalty case, and the same jurors that are going to find him guilty are also going to decide on the death penalty and make the recommendation to the judge. So the prosecution wants the jurors to hear all this. The prosecution wants the jurors to not feel any remorse in a death penalty recommendation. And
who better to have it come from than this girl who lived it?
And they want to paint the picture, and the defendant, Shawn Grate, is, I am sure, enjoying reliving it because this is what he lives for, and he needs the thrill of the kill in order to survive.
And here's the scary part, is she said she had been in that house before, right? And so he created this environment where she felt she was safe on previous occasions, until that horrible day when he said to her, "You're not going anywhere."
Right. He turned. He gained her trust. He got her into a vulnerable situation. He was on a killing spree that month. I mean, you're talking about 3 victims in 1 month. Plus, now we're hearing of other victims before that, but he was on a killing spree. He had no impulse control. He was trying to collect the bodies. He was getting off on those. He was getting high on these acts. And when that one body is dead and mutilated and thrown in the closet or into a crawl hole, he's got to go find another one. He needs his fix. He needs his high. It's like a drug addiction. It's a mental illness. It's a mental imbalance. Not legal mental illness, but he's mentally deranged.
Yeah, and all this can come in really to a great extent depending on how much the prosecution feels that they need to explore it to get jurors to understand how a person could present one way but really be another, and just how abnormal that is. And really what they have to do is they have to prove that the evil side is what he truly is, right? That this was not an aberration, that this was not something that happened in the heat of the moment, that this is the way that he is, that the kindness or the goofiness that this victim describes, that's a farce, that's not reality.
That was calculating. That was his means to an end. He knew exactly what he was doing. His goal is to isolate them and gain their trust, to disarm them, bring them into his home, his solitary home, his whorehouse, and take advantage.
With the intent to kill. Let's listen to some more of that victim's riveting testimony. And welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. So you were just listening to that riveting testimony of this kidnapping victim who survived, and she's explaining how she met Shawn Grate, how he entrapped her, how he raped her, how he tortured her. We're going to come back with more of that testimony after a quick commercial break. But in the meantime, I want to thank my fellow Law and Crime hosts, Carissa Kranz, for joining me and for doing all of the analysis today for our Law and Crime Network viewers and our SiriusXM listeners. So stick with us, and we'll have more of that victim, the surviving victim's testimony, when we come back.